Okay, guys, we're going to talk about the signs and symptoms of hyperglycemia, high blood sugar. And if you remember, and if you recall, that the only way that glucose can go from the blood into the cell is by insulin binding to a receptor and then opening up that gate. So if somebody's blood sugar is really high, I don't know, let's say 800, that means they don't have insulin. So remember, you got some sodium in the blood, you got that big freaking protein, albumin in your blood, big Al, right? But now you got a lot of glucose in your blood. And remember, it's not the size of the stuff, it's the number of stuffs. So remember, you got potassium inside your cells, right? And the part of the brain that controls hunger, temperature, and thirst is the hypothalamus, the H-thal. And embedded in the hypothalamus are osmoreceptors. And if you recall, osmolarity is stuff over water, or solute over solvent. And remember that the goal of the body is to maintain a balance between the osmolarity of the blood and the osmolarity within the cell. The other thing you need to remember is if stuff can't move, and the stuff that can't move this time is glucose, water can always move. And water will always move from an area of low osmolarity through a selectively permeable membrane to an area of high osmolarity. And this happens in all the cells of the body. So all the cells of the body are exposed to this high blood sugar. So if your blood sugar is 900, you're going to have a lot of glucose in your blood. What up, G? And because you don't have insulin, if your blood sugar is 900, then glucose is not going to be able to go from the blood into the cell. And if stuff can't move, water can always move. And water is always going to move from an area of low osmolarity. So in this case, the osmolarity is low in the H-thal. So the osmolarity is low in the H-thal. And the osmolarity is high in the blood because osmolarity is stuff over water. So you got a lot more stuff. So to try to balance it out, water by osmosis is going to move from an area of low osmolarity to high osmolarity. And that is going to increase the osmolarity within the H-thal. And anytime you increase the osmolarity within the H-thal, that triggers osmoreceptors on the H-thal, and that tells you to drink. So that explains, this little diagram here explains one of the signs and symptoms of hyperglycemia, the first one being polydipsia. Polydipsia, many drinks, so they're drinking water all the time. All right, now let's look at this too. What's the only fuel the brain can use and use well? It's glucose. Well, if you don't have insulin, glucose can't go from the blood into the H-thal to feed it. So the H-thal, the hypothalamus, is thinking, even though the glucose is in the blood, it can't get to where it needs to go. So if you don't have food, even though you're looking at food like through a window, if you can't get at it, you're going to be hungry. So the lack of glucose to the hypothalamus, that's going to produce the polyphagia, many eats. And then finally, remember, your blood sugar is not just high in your hypothalamus, it's high all over. So all of the cells of your body are going to be exposed to this very high blood sugar, so all your cells. So your blood sugar is going to be really high all over, 900 all over, right? So here we go, right? And then you got some potassium in the cell, yeah? So all the cells are going to have water sucked out of them by the osmotic effect of that high glucose, because water always moves from an area of a lot of water and less stuff through a selectively permeable membrane to an area of more stuff and less water. So water will be removed from all the cells of your body by osmosis. And when you add water to the bloodstream, it increases your blood volume. And that increases your blood pressure. And when you increase your blood pressure, that increases the amount of pee. So that explains our third sign, which is polyuria. Now, look, they're not peeing just because they're drinking more. They're peeing more because all the fluid is getting sucked out of the cells and into the blood. And again, anytime you increase your blood volume, you're going to increase your blood pressure, and that's going to make you pee more. That's just the way it works. It's called pressure diuresis. So those are the three classic signs and symptoms. But in someone who has not been diagnosed, right, the other effects that they're going to get. Now remember that insulin determines the fuel that's most readily available. And in a fat cell, you got triglyceride. And when insulin's around, right, it's going to take triglyceride that was in the blood and pack it in the fat cells. So that fat's going to get locked up in that fat cell, and any fat that's already in the fat cell is going to get locked up. So that way you can use the glucose for fuel because you want to lower the blood sugar. But in the case where you are a diabetic and you are not taking your insulin or you haven't been diagnosed yet, then you don't have insulin. So what that means is your blood sugar is going to be high, right, 900. And if you don't have insulin, you don't have insulin to put fat in a fat cell, and you don't have insulin to keep fat in a fat cell. So what happens? It's a fat triglyceride free-for-all. So the fat cells put little diving boards on them, and all the triglyceride that used to be stored there now jumps into the blood. Whee! Them Duke boys got my money. So what will happen is that triglyceride will become the most readily available fuel. For the other cells of your body to use. So the cells of the body will start metabolizing fat. Why? Because you can't use glucose because you don't have insulin. So they will also have dramatic weight loss. So some people, before they're diagnosed, or if they're not controlling their diabetes well, they're not taking their insulin, they can lose up to 10, 20, 30 pounds in a month. It's dramatic. The other thing that insulin does, and we talked about this, is the functions of insulin, is in muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells. Remember, muscle protein is turned over, right? You break it down, but then you got to rebuild it. And one of the functions of insulin is to allow amino acids into the blood, or into the cell. And when amino acids go into the cell, they can rebuild, they will rebuild muscle. But if you don't have insulin, you can't get the amino acids into the cell. So muscle protein will get broke down. It just won't get rebuilt. So the other symptom of diabetes is muscle wasting. Now, in an acute case where the blood sugar is really high, let's say a diabetic is sick, or they're sick and they haven't taken their insulin, so their blood sugar gets really high, like 900, right? So what's the treatment? The treatment is to give them insulin to get the sugar down. One of the problems of treating people with diabetes and treating them with insulin is, what does insulin do to fat? Well, if you got insulin in your blood now, because you're injecting it a couple times a day, any triglyceride that's in the blood, it is going to store it in fat cells. And it's going to prevent fat from being released from fat cells. So one of the problems that people don't like when they're being treated with their diabetes is they will gain weight. And they don't like it. So those are the signs and symptoms of hyperglycemia, high blood sugar. Hope that helped.